Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. Today is Tuesday, the 18th May 2020. Over the past few days, many things happened in Hong Kong. I invite Ben Rogers, British journalist and human rights activist, to give his opinion about the latest incidents and the changes in Hong Kong. Hello, Ben.
Hello, good to be with you.
Glad to be with you too. And let us begin from talking about the incidents happening in Hong Kong legislature. So three things attract my attention. Firstly, the pro-Beijing Starry Lee was allegedly elected to be the chairperson of the House Committee. Secondly, to pass the national anthem bill this month is now a priority of the legislature. Finally, Carrie Lam's government is to recruit police officers as polling staff for September's legislative election. What is your opinion?
I think these are yet another or yet more examples of the Chinese Communist Party's direct intervention in Hong Kong's political affairs, and they represent further threats to whatever remains, if anything does remain, of one country, two systems and of Hong Kong's freedoms and the rule of law. For example, in the Legislative Council, the scenes were absolutely appalling of pro-Beijing legislators effectively staging a coup on the floor of the legislature, seizing the chair of the House committee, physically preventing pro-democracy legislators from being in the chamber to cast their votes, and basically adopting the position of, if they can't win and get their legislation through the proper procedures and through the democratic procedures, they're prepared to resort to really thuggery to get their way. And so I think the international community should be very concerned at the abuses of the procedures in LegCo, even resorting to some physical intimidation and even violence. Some legislators physically prevented. Of course, the previous week, some legislators were attacked and were carried out of the chamber. So all these developments are extremely concerning. With regard to the announcement about the police's role in the elections, again, I think this is, given the record of the Hong Kong police of consistent, totally disproportionate, appalling brutality, the idea of giving them any kind of role in the election process is truly shocking, and again suggests that Beijing is prepared to do anything it takes to prevent a proper democratic process in those elections, to prevent the pro-democracy camp from making any gains, and to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party has its rule and tightens its grip on Hong Kong. So these are, I think, dying days for Hong Kong unless the international community does something.
And what about the national anthem bill? So have you heard about it?
I've heard about it a lot, and I've been following it for some time. And I think it's an extremely dangerous piece of legislation. First of all, it's incredibly vaguely defined. It criminalizes perceived insults to the national anthem, but it doesn't really specify what counts as an insult. And in any case, the idea of criminalizing people who might boo a national anthem or express their political views is yet again another assault on the basic freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. So it's a very worrying and dangerous bill.
So what about Carrie Lam's government plan to recruit police officers as polling staff for the forthcoming legislative election?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think given the record of the Hong Kong police with consistent, totally disproportionate, shocking violence against peaceful protesters, indiscriminate acts of brutality, I think the idea of giving them any kind of role in the election process is really shocking, and it's yet another example of Carrie Lam acting as the puppet of the Chinese Communist Party, showing a determination to do whatever it takes to achieve the results that Beijing wants and not the results that the Hong Kong people wish to express.
Yeah. So let's move on to the judicial part, okay? Also, I noted three things. First of all, 14 were charged and one wanted for rioting on the campus of Hong Kong Polytechnic University during the siege between 17th and 29th November 2019. And secondly, a 22-year-old man has been sentenced to 4 years behind bars for rioting over his role in the protest outside the Legislative Council on 20th June last year. And thirdly, a 60-year-old man who was allegedly the victim of police brutality while in custody in hospital last year was sentenced to 6 months in prison for assaulting an officer and another person. What do you think about this?
Well, I don't know the details of each of the individual cases, but what I can say is that two things. First of all, I don't condone violence on the part of protesters, and we must acknowledge that a small minority of the protesters last year did carry out acts of violence. If there are genuine acts of violence, then of course the law must take its course, and I can't really stand in the way of that. But what I would say, my second clear point, is that the definition of rioting in Hong Kong is extraordinarily broad and vague. And yes, there were incidents of violence on the part of some protesters, but there were many protesters who in most definitions would have been peaceful protesters rather than rioters. And I'm concerned that they may be caught up in these charges. The Public Order Ordinance, which I'm sad to say was, of course, a colonial legacy. It was a piece of legislation that the British colonial government introduced. Chris Patten, as the last governor, did try to reform it. The United Nations has said that it is not consistent with the standards under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but Hong Kong has not amended the Public Order Ordinance, and that law catches a lot of people who are not at all involved in rioting. So with these particular cases, I don't know the details of the individual cases, but I think the international community should follow these cases very closely. Firstly, to make sure, are they genuinely is there genuine evidence that they were engaged in what we would really understand to be rioting, acts of violence and disorder? If so, then the law must take its course. But if not, then the charges should be dropped. And even if there's evidence to go with the charges, we must make sure that the trials are free and fair, that they're given due process, that they're given proper legal representation, and that if they are convicted, the penalties are proportionate to what they actually engaged in. So I'm very concerned that there's a real danger that these trials will be politicized and that we'll go away from whatever the truth of the individual acts and evidence is, and result in a politicized trial that will not do justice.
So then, concerning the executive part, the new Chief of Civil Service, Patrick Nip, requested the civil servants to be politically neutral but loyal to the Chief Executive Carrie Lam and her administration. So how is that possible?
That is quite an absurd statement, and it captures the absurdity of Hong Kong's political system at the moment. Civil servants, yes, should absolutely be neutral, but they should be loyal to their country, or to, in the case of Hong Kong, to the territory of Hong Kong, not to an individual leader. If you said to civil servants in the UK, are they loyal to Boris Johnson. No, they're loyal to the government of the day and to the country and the national interest. And to require them to be loyal to Carrie Lam personally, or to I mean, that is in itself politicizing the civil service and actually taking away their neutrality. So it's a contradiction in terms.
Okay, now let's talk about the press. So Carrie Lam will give more power to the police to monitor social media and will enforce the so-called code of practice for journalists. And also, the director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office had told the chief executive to rein in Radio Television Hong Kong, RTHK. So what's your comment?
Well, yet again, this is another strand in the Chinese Communist Party's all-out assault on Hong Kong's basic freedoms, and this is an attack on press freedom and freedom of expression. The idea of reining in and the idea of a Beijing government office asking the Hong Kong government to rein in, to use those words, the public service broadcaster RTHK is an appalling violation of press freedom. In regard to the social media and the journalists' code of conduct, again, those are real threats to basic freedoms. There is a big difference between legitimate monitoring of social media in order to prevent real acts of crime or terrorism, and monitoring it in order to silence dissent and silence political opinion. And my great fear is that if there's an all-out monitoring of social media in such an intrusive way, that will be used for totally wrong reasons to further repress political dissent in Hong Kong. And with regard to the journalists, well, we've already seen journalists in Hong Kong come under sustained harassment and abuse, even pepper spray and threats from the Hong Kong police. And this will be yet another development in the restriction of press freedom in Hong Kong.
I don't know whether you know, there's an episode, yeah. The U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo issued a warning to China for interfering with the American journalists reporting from Hong Kong, and cautioned China that if there's some interference, the USA would consider that would be possible to affect the bilateral relations. So what's your comment about that?
Well, obviously the bilateral relations between the United States and China are coming under sustained pressure across a range of fronts, and all of that is coming because of the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party regime. And this is yet another issue that will further strain the relationship. And yeah, if the Chinese Communist Party regime hinder and harass and impede the work of journalists, and particularly foreign journalists in Hong Kong, that is bound to strain not just US-China relations, but I think China's relations with the international community. Hong Kong has been until now such an important global city, a truly international hub in Asia, both as a financial center, but also as a center for international media and others. And if foreign journalists come under pressure in Hong Kong, that is going to damage not just press freedom, but actually further damage Hong Kong's standing in the world. So it's an issue that ought to concern not just Secretary Pompeo, but the whole international community.
Yeah. So in this education sector, last Friday, the 15th May, the Education Bureau ordered the examination authority to pull a question on Japanese occupation of China in the early 20th century. So the following day, two officials of the exam authorities resigned. So what is your opinion?
Well, once again, this is an illustration of the Chinese Communist Party's direct intrusion in Hong Kong and direct disrespect for Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong was promised, when it was handed over to China in 1997, 23 years ago, a high degree of autonomy, one country, two systems, Hong Kong people running Hong Kong. And the only issues that Beijing should be directly involved in and responsible for are foreign affairs and defense and security. And yet Beijing is intruding into pretty much everything now in Hong Kong. And to be intervening in the education curriculum in this way, I think is very concerning. Of course, it's not the first time it's happened. There was an attempt some years ago to shape a more sort of patriotic education curriculum along Beijing's lines, and that's what sparked Joshua Wong as a young activist, and he formed scholarism as a movement against this, and of course then went on to become one of the best-known faces of Hong Kong's democracy movement. And I think that this kind of intervention, as well as, of course, it comes just a few days after Carrie Lam blamed the education system for the democracy movement, for the protest movement, as if somehow she's implying that people are being taught wrong ideas and totally ignoring the fact that actually people have their own ideas and their own values and are protesting because they want Hong Kong's freedoms to be preserved, not because they're being unduly influenced. So this kind of intervention in Hong Kong's education system is just another strand in the overall erosion which was sort of slow and steady over recent years, but has accelerated very dramatically, even just in the last few weeks. And it should be a big concern for the international community.
So the government still bans social gathering, yeah? On Saturday, the police arrested several people in the East Point City Mall, and as officers warned people inside that they were participating in an illegal assembly. And also the government is to extend a law banning gatherings of more than 8 people until 4th June, citing the coronavirus as an excuse. So what's your view?
This is obviously a somewhat more difficult topic because many countries now have restrictions in place because of the coronavirus, including the UK ourselves. So it's a little more difficult to be directly critical of. But I would say that we should not allow the Hong Kong government to misuse the genuine, legitimate need to impose restrictions because of the coronavirus. To misuse those for political reasons. So those measures should be short-term, as they are in this country. They should be used only for public health reasons, and they should not be used as an excuse to silence dissent. And if there are ways that the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong can gather or can hold activities that don't breach legitimate coronavirus restrictions, then there's no excuse for interference in them.
Yeah. So the Hong Kong Independent Police Complaints Council (Ipcc) released a report, on 15th May. And concludes that there is no misconduct of the police force, no collusion between the police and the thugs. In last year, during the protests. So do you agree?
No, I don't agree at all. This report was one of the most, there've been many absurd things that have come out of the Hong Kong government and Chinese Communist Party in related institutions. but this is one of the most absurd. It's a complete whitewash and a complete, almost Orwellian turning on its head of the truth. It's clearly obvious from what we've seen over the last year that the Hong Kong police, firstly, has consistently, day after day, not just one-off incidents, but pretty much every time they've been engaged in responding to protests in Hong Kong, have carried out indiscriminate, disproportionate, extremely brutal violence. And I would just say, I mean, I understand, and I've never been a police officer myself, but I can understand that for a policeman, it's challenging when you're trying to deal with large crowds, and it's challenging when you're dealing with people who may be, a small number of people who may be engaged in acts of violence, throwing bricks or Molotov cocktails. So I'm not under any illusions that policing is an easy job, but nevertheless, there are legitimate forms of policing and there are completely unacceptable forms of policing. And what we've seen from the Hong Kong police force has been truly outrageous on a consistent scale, attacking peaceful protesters, attacking passers-by, verbally abusing people who even have nothing to do with the movement. And then when it comes to the Yuen Long incident, it's really clear that these thugs came totally launched an unprovoked attack on people, again very indiscriminately, not just targeted at pro-democracy protesters, but lots of innocent passers-by got caught up in it. And the police took an extraordinarily long time to come, and when they did eventually come, it was too late, and they didn't do anything. So that suggests, well, at best, a real incompetence on the part of the Hong Kong police force. But I strongly think that it's not that. It was collusion, and what is needed is a genuinely independent inquiry. Clearly, this mechanism is not fit for purpose. It's not able to carry out its inquiries in anything like an independent way. And I think we need now an international independent inquiry, because Carrie Lam has made clear she's not prepared to have any genuinely independent inquiry in Hong Kong. So I think the international community needs to take this up.
Yeah, okay. So based on these mentioned incidents, Hong Kong is evidenced changing for the worse, yeah. These changes disclose the damages caused by the CCP of various organs of the governmental institutions of Hong Kong. There is no one country, two systems, but one country, one system. So in your capacity as the Deputy Chairman of Conservative Party Human Rights Committee and the founder of Hong Kong Watch, what can you do to counter this affront?
Well, a number of things. Let me start perhaps briefly with Hong Kong Watch, and then I'll come on to the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. I co-founded both organizations. I co-founded Hong Kong Watch in 2017, as we talked about in the previous episode, and Hong Kong Watch exists to monitor very closely what's happening in Hong Kong, to both not just respond to events on a day-to-day basis, although we do that, but also to provide in-depth research and briefing to policymakers around the world, in the British Parliament and government, the European Parliament, the United States Congress, Canada, Germany, and elsewhere. And so our role is to try to make sure that parliamentarians, policymakers, and the media do not ignore Hong Kong. And I think that's especially important right now, because as you rightly said earlier, people are understandably very focused on the coronavirus pandemic in their own countries and the challenges that brings. But we mustn't allow the Chinese Communist Party to use this time to get away with the things they're doing. So in Hong Kong Watch, our role is to sound the alarm, is to inform people, is to lobby governments for action. And I think there's much more we need to do, but I think we've achieved quite a lot in terms of, before Hong Kong Watch was founded, really the level of awareness about Hong Kong in the British Parliament and elsewhere was shockingly low, and it's much, much higher now. And there are many more parliamentarians speaking out for Hong Kong. We need even more, but we've made a lot of progress. In terms of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, I was also involved in helping to found that about 15 years ago in 2005. And we held a big inquiry on human rights in China, including Hong Kong, in 2016. And we published a report that came out of that inquiry. The report is called The Darkest Moment, the Crackdown on Human Rights in China 2013 to 2016, looking at the first few years of Xi Jinping's rule. And we decided actually in January this year, so before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK, so it wasn't because of that, but it was because of the accumulation of various events. We decided to hold a new inquiry this year, looking at the period 2016, when we did our last report, to 2020, so the past 4 years. And the reason we decided to hold this new inquiry is that so much has happened and so much has deteriorated in China and including Hong Kong in the last 4 years. We've seen, obviously, the situation in Xinjiang deteriorate dramatically. We've seen the repression in mainland China of different groups of dissidents, of Christians, of civil society, human rights lawyers, and of course the situation in Hong Kong, which has deteriorated so dramatically, especially in the last year, and even more so in the last few weeks. So the purpose of the inquiry is to gather evidence of what has happened in the last 4 years, and crucially to gather recommendations for what the British government can and should do. And so we've held, I think, about 8 online sessions where we've had individual experts, activists, giving evidence to us, because we would have done it in Parliament, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't do it in Parliament. So we've been holding those sessions online. We've also already received maybe 30 or 40 written submissions from different human rights organizations, academics and experts, and exiled Chinese dissidents as well, and groups in Hong Kong. And the deadline for the inquiry is the 1st of June. So there's still time if viewers are watching this and want to get information and recommendations to us. If they get it to us by the 1st of June, we can still consider it. I think this is a very timely moment for such an inquiry, because we didn't realize it when we decided in January to hold the inquiry, but as a result of the coronavirus, more and more people, I think, are waking up to the dangers of the CCP, to the truth about the CCP, and more people are calling for a rethink in British policy towards the CCP. So our hope is that this inquiry, which will result in a report, will contribute to that rethink, particularly on the human rights situation in mainland China and in Hong Kong, and will contribute towards leading to a change of policy that really tries to tackle the appalling human rights situation.
So, what were your main findings of the 2013 to 16 inquiry?
Well, our main finding was really that even in those first 3 years after Xi Jinping came to power, the human rights situation in China and including Hong Kong deteriorated dramatically. The reason we called the report The Darkest Moment was that that phrase came from evidence submitted to us by a Chinese activist who said that this 2016 was the darkest moment for human rights since the Tiananmen massacre. Of course, we have a challenge now with our new report, because things have got even worse since then. And so if that was the darkest moment in 2016, we have to think, what are we going to call the new report? But that was our overall finding, was that things had deteriorated very dramatically under Xi, that whereas, and I remember this on a personal level, I used to travel to China regularly, and I remember about 10 years ago meeting with human rights lawyers in Beijing in a restaurant in Beijing, and having a very open conversation about their work, about the development of the rule of law, about the space for civil society in China. And of course, we all know that the CCP has always been repressive, and I'm not saying that things were free at all then, but without doubt there was a little bit more space then than there has been under Xi Jinping. Under Xi Jinping, those lawyers that I met all disappeared. They were either jailed or genuinely disappeared. We don't know where they are, or have been disbarred. And the space that existed for civil society, for bloggers, for journalists, for lawyers, has completely disappeared. And that was our finding in 2016. And I believe already from the evidence we've received, and we'll see what we conclude at the end of the process, but even from what we've seen so far, it's worsened even since then.
Oh, yeah. So in that case, how different are the subjects between the first and the second inquiries?
Well, the subjects are fairly similar because the issues have not changed, except that they've worsened. So the issues of Hong Kong, of Xinjiang, of religious violations of religious freedom, freedom of expression, and so on. I guess one thing that is a newer development that we were just beginning to see in 2016, but is much more advanced now, is the growth of the surveillance state in China. The use of technology, of artificial intelligence, and so on, to repress basic freedoms. That I think is a new development that has advanced significantly since 2016, and that will be a big feature of our report.
So, do you have any other things to emphasize on Hong Kong?
Well, I think what I would emphasize about Hong Kong is that this really is a wake-up moment for the international community. I mean, it needs to be a wake-up moment. It's a wake-up call for the international community. And if the international community fails to hear that wake-up call, then, and we don't have much time, the international community needs to move robustly and move fast. And if it fails to do so, not only will Hong Kong and Hong Kong people lose their freedoms, one country, two systems will be dead, they will become just another Chinese city, and that will be a tragedy for them. It will mean that Britain in particular will have broken its promises, as well as China breaking theirs, because Britain has a responsibility under the Sino-British Joint Declaration to monitor and to speak out and to defend the freedoms that were promised to the people of Hong Kong. But it will also have two other effects. One is that it will mean that the world will lose a major international financial center, and because Hong Kong's success as an international financial center depends on its rule of law, transparency, basic freedoms, and autonomy. And if it loses all of those things, which it's almost has already, then its viability as an international financial center is therefore undermined. And that has serious repercussions for the international community, but actually also for China, because China still needs Hong Kong as a financial center. But the last thing it will also mean is that it will be a direct assault on the international rules-based system, because if we allow the Chinese Communist Party to tear up promises that were made under an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is lodged at the United Nations, then how can we ever believe or trust any of their promises under any other international treaty? And that calls into question, therefore, the whole international rules-based system. So I think it is in the international community's interests to hear this wake-up call, to not just speak out for Hong Kong, but to act in terms of imposing Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions on mainland and Hong Kong officials responsible for serious human rights violations, act in terms of other forms of pressure, working together with other countries to pressure China to stop the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms, and act in terms of trying to help those who are most vulnerable in Hong Kong. So I hope the international community will hear this wake-up call before it's too late, because we're running out of time.
And also, it's very alarming, as you mentioned before, that this Hong Kong lawmaker is said to be going to bring up the issue of introducing Article 22 to the National People's Congress. Could you elaborate that for us?
Well, this news I just heard shortly before starting this interview, and I don't know if it's absolutely confirmed, but the news reports that I saw said that this person, I believe her name is Maggie Chan, who is a Hong Kong member of the National People's Congress, has said that she might try to introduce Article 23, which is the national security law, the anti-subversion law, through the NPC rather than through Hong Kong's Legislative Council, therefore bypassing Hong Kong's legislature. But in doing that, I mean, firstly, that will make Hong Kong's legislature completely irrelevant and effectively dead. But it will also impose on Hong Kong, against the will of Hong Kong people, a law that will have a devastating effect on basic freedom of expression.
Based on my school's information, the USA is considering to remove the free trade status of Hong Kong. So do you think that could be a positive option to help Hong Kong?
I think it certainly has to be on the table. I've been reluctant to call for it as such, because it would have a very serious effect on Hong Kong's economy, and therefore potentially on the livelihoods of Hong Kong people. And I would never want that. But on the other hand, the whole premise of that legislation is based on Hong Kong having a different system from mainland China, having one country, two systems. And if one country, two systems is effectively dead, then what is the validity of giving Hong Kong special status? So I think it should definitely be on the table. It should be used as a warning to the Hong Kong government and the government in Beijing that if they don't rethink and rethink urgently, this could be used. So yes, I think it should be clearly on the table.
Okay, so thank you, Ben. So briefly, let's conclude. The situations in Hong Kong are deteriorating quickly. Hong Kong people are yelling for help. President Trump, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the leaders of democratic countries, please step in to stop the CCP from killing Hong Kong and its people. So thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you very much.